see the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Good morning and welcome to Artefact Live, the art and science of storytelling. With me, the host, Scott MacArthur. It's good to be back again this week, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed last week. It was a terrific show, and the good news is we've got more of the same coming over the next few weeks. This week is no exception, and we're going to be looking at an aspect of storytelling that we've not really covered before, and that is what you can do with it in terms of therapy, in terms of helping people, in terms of helping people deal, in this case, with trauma. I'm excited about that. But before we do that, I've spent, seems like half of my life this last 2 weeks creating a podcast from this vlog. A number of people have said to me that they wished that I would release this as a podcast, and that has proven to be quite tricky, much trickier than I expected, and my editing skills have definitely been tested. I've now done, I think, 6 shows, and they are now available on all the platforms except iTunes because it's not quite ready yet. It should be ready in the next 24 hours, so it's out of my hands. But if you don't have time to watch a vlog, or you just want shorter snippets, then the podcast is probably for you. And of course, it's called Artefact Live. I see I've got a couple of people in here. Hello, James. This is what you call a crossover person. James is one of our musical guys. So it's nice to have you here, James. How you doing? No cheek on this show now, young man. And that's quite cool. I'm glad you're here, James. So without further ado, I'd like to just bring my guest on, Olivia. Now, Olivia James, let me just give you some history. We've only known each other. I'll put Olivia on. Here we go. Olivia, hi.
Hello.
There's no point in talking about you not having you on. How are you?
I'm pretty groovy, yes.
Good. How long have we known each other now?
Probably at least, well, over 2 years. I'd say maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and we met. There's an association for professional speakers, and I think we met. Was it in London? We met the first time. I think it was.
We did.
Yeah. So we'll not say much about the association, but we can certainly say some things about what we've done together. So, Olivia, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, could you give us a little bit of an introduction as to what it is you do, please?
Yeah. So I'm a therapist, and I coach, and I treat all sorts of things from anxiety issues, public speaking anxiety, all the way to full-blown PTSD and trauma. And of course, sometimes there is trauma associated with public speaking and public speaking anxiety. So sometimes a client has never had a problem public speaking, but then they have a bad thing happen on stage. And you and I, professional speakers, we've when a bad thing happens on stage, everyone can witness us. Yes. So that can be quite traumatic. So sometimes somebody's been on stage, been doing a presentation, and then their mind goes completely blank. So that becomes a bit of a trauma. So I sort of operate in that space of anxiety, trauma, and confidence.
Okay. There's a whole lot of supplementaries are going to fly off of that, as you can imagine, Olivia. How though? What's your story? How did you get into that field?
Yeah, so sort of my gateway drug into the whole therapy thing is I used to do body work and massage, and then I realized often with people there was a lot of trauma held in the body. I went through a divorce, and I can tell you it was really very traumatic. It was not fun, and I went and had a session with somebody we're going to talk about trauma and storytelling. So I had a little bit of talk therapy, which kind of had its limits. Then I went and had a session with a woman who did this kind of weird technique, and I thought, my God, this is really good. So I learned how to do that. Then I actually, after my divorce, I was actually living in a house, like a 3-bed house with just me. So I started renting out rooms to actors of the local theatre company, and I got to know a lot of actors, and I got to sort of understand some of their issues to do with performance anxiety. Then sort of gradually it morphed where people were referring people to me with public speaking anxiety, all the way from like oil executives to like people in the creative and legal financial industry. So basically it morphed, and I added layers and layers of different modalities, trauma modalities, when we were getting ready to go on. I mean, I did quite a lot of training in America, for example, for my trauma work.
Yes.
Layers and layers and layers of training and experience, and now I have quite a wide sort of a very comprehensive toolkit with which I can help people.
So when you say trauma in the body, what do you mean by that? What does that mean?
So there is this idea that if a bad thing has happened to you, that you just sort of talk to a therapist and like tell your story, and then it becomes okay, right? That somehow that's sort of like that's what's meant to help you. Now, most of the time when somebody has had a trauma, like a really bad accident, or like a physical assault or something, the trauma is actually stored like in a lower part of the brain than just the rational logical part, and also it's stored in the body. So there's this feeling of being unsafe. I'll give you an example. I had quite a nasty accident. I was on a bicycle, and I was at a junction waiting to pull out, and the van in front of me, instead of pulling out forward, slammed its reversing lights on and smashed into me and like knocked me out. I had some very unpleasant like dental facial injuries. I'll spare you the gory details, but basically ever since then, every time I saw reversing lights, I would get that panic feeling coming up very, very suddenly. Now, going to see a therapist and sort of getting to a logical understanding why those reversing lights were triggering me, and saying, well, of course you do realize that, just because you see reversing lights doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to smash into you again. That logical part of my brain isn't interested at all. So there is this idea that you just sort of talk about trauma and then you're fine. But in my experience, personal and professional, that just isn't the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. The idea of storytelling in this space, then, I mean, there's three reasons why I wanted you on this show. One is I think you're really good at what you do. Second thing is you tell a good story, and the third thing is you're on the edge of some of this work that you do. That some of the therapies you use are quite interesting and challenging, etc. But go back a step if you can. The word trigger.
Yes.
If I'm honest, I'm sick to the back teeth of the word trigger, because everybody's saying, "Oh, I'm triggered," and it's like I find it deeply boring. And I've been offended. Well, I couldn't give a monkey's if I've offended you. It's your problem from my perspective. Couldn't care less. But I know that's slightly unfair when you're talking about trauma, proper trauma.
Yeah.
I'm not being flippant about that. I mean, I was being flippant a minute ago. I'm not being now. Why do you think that is? Why is it that an accident and in a red light, I think it's the association of the two that causes that trigger? But talk about trigger. It doesn't sit with me.
Right.
Help me understand it. Help me understand it.
Well, you're obviously, you're trained in biology and psychology. So it's like a little micro cue so this reversing light that I saw, that next time, ever since then, when I saw it, before I dealt with it, that reversing light would provoke a fear response in me, and it isn't a conscious decision. So, that thing about, some people just love to be offended and they love to like
Oh,
take
yeah.
offense. So a trigger, I didn't have any choice about whether that red light, that reversing light was a trigger for me, because it would
Okay.
immediately, a panic would rise in me, and it wasn't a
Right.
conscious decision. So in that sense, it's a trauma trigger. It's like I've written a piece about vicarious trauma. There was a returning serviceman who came from you know, I think he'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he came back home, he had full-blown PTSD. He would be walking down the street and he would smell like a smell of a burning tire, and that would trigger him. That would provoke that response in him. Now, unfortunately, like, he didn't get, you know, he unfortunately committed suicide because of, you know, his PTSD was so bad that he just couldn't cope. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about when I'm talking about a trigger like that. It's a small little thing that will provoke that whole thing, that whole sort of situation where there is a risk of serious harm. That's what we're talking about when we talk about trauma.
Okay.
It's like serious harm to us,
Right.
you know, a physical harm. So that's, and of course, like the nervous system, it wants to keep us safe.
Yes.
And so what it does is it like anything that reminds us of the thing that hurt us, it's going to be super aware. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about trigger. I'm not talking about snowflakes.
I didn't think you were, to be honest. I was just having a whinge.
Yeah.
Why is it then? I mean, this. I know that this is undiscovered country, much of this, because we don't really understand the human brain at all. But why is it then that sometimes things trigger you and other times they don't? So, for example, I've been in accidents, never had a trigger issue, and well, not that I know of. Maybe I have had, but not that I know of. I've had moments on the keynote stage where I've had just a couple, thankfully, that have been horrific. And actually, one of them was my fault, to be honest. But I don't think I've ever suffered. I mean, I'm always, well, you know this because I've told you, but, you know, I get very nervous before I go on stage. But once I'm on stage, I'm okay. It's like, it just bang, it just sort of clicks in. So I'm adding too many layers to this question, but why is it that sometimes you get traumatized and sometimes you don't? There you go. There's a simpler question.
That's a very multi-layered question.
Right.
So you talking about you being on stage, one thing I know about you, we've talked about it, you prepare like a mofo. So that means that if you are a little bit nervous or you get a little bit distracted or you're tired, you've still got that grounding. You've got, because you've honed and prepared what you're going to say so much that you won't get thrown off as easily as somebody who hasn't prepared. That's number one. You know, some people seem to be like, they can have various, like, you know, we talk about, there's a lot of stuff to do with childhood development trauma. There's a lot of criticism of this thing called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which are meant to be a predictor of like your future physical and psychological health. Some people just seem like to be able to cope with stuff better. You could say some people probably cope with being dissociated or other kind of like coping mechanisms, and you know, some people might just, you know, turn into a whinging so and so. So it's really hard to say. I mean, I know people who have had some hideous stuff happen to them, and they are, you know, they have a lot of you know, still a lot of belief in humanity, and they kind of enjoy life. And other people haven't had so much happen to them, and they are just, you know, always like feeling sorry for themselves and worrying about everything. So I think there is a personality, probably there is a part of that, your own kind of like a constitution and your sensibilities, as well as I think there is a lot of choice there too. There is choice there in how you handle stuff, you know, how you handle life, basically.
I think there probably is some degree of victimhood in the current environment as well.
Oh, absolutely.
We both know many victims who live on that victimhood, and it's sometimes not helped by the political system either. But there's a question here for you, Olivia, from James, and he's asking, can triggers be a good thing?
Well, they can, because ultimately what the nervous system wants you to be safe. So the nervous system will always err on the side of caution. So it's better for me to be a little bit freaked out when I see a reversing light than for a car to come and mow me down again.
Yes.
So it's a trigger. The idea is that it's like quickly gets you alert, gets you into that fight flight mode, gets you ready to like take action. So triggers can be a good thing, but they can also be kind of hideous. So I've done quite a lot of work in the kind of like people recovering from kind of like sexual violence and stuff. So what can happen to those people is that when they're having like a smear test, they can get triggered. So obviously a smear test is a very good thing, like a preventative health thing, but it can be incredibly triggering to be in a medical situation like that. So triggers can be a good thing, but as much as possible, we need to like tell the body like when it's actually safe and when it isn't safe, if that makes sense. So we need to teach people how to self-regulate, and sometimes those triggers they're not conscious decisions at all. So that's kind of like that's how it works.
It's interesting that, because I know we've spoken about it before, but I think, and you'll have some way, I would imagine, of interpreting this, but I think what I've done is, and it was nice of you to say about my prep, but I think I need to do that. I now think that, I think if I didn't do that, and I'm not prepared to test it. No, I'm not. But I think if I didn't do that, I would worry about what would happen on stage. I'm okay with the impromptu. If someone says to me, "Oh, go and stand on the stage for 5 minutes and tell us what you think about that," that's okay. But if someone then said, go onto the stage and speak for 45 minutes, I think I would go back to another speech rather than try to wing it, because winging it is possible, but only when you're really well prepared.
Yes, exactly.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
And of course, you've got to think as you do, because I know you've got to think about this. Like, say there's 200 people in the room, you're there for an hour. If you mess it up, you wasted everybody's time.
Yes.
Harmed your reputation and your earning potential. So there is a lot riding on it. One of the things that I find with clients when they come and see me and they've had a bad experience on stage, and where so the worst thing that can happen is that their mind goes completely blank. Gosh. And it does happen.
Yes.
When that happens, every single time, tiredness is a factor. So they've flown to a conference and they're speaking like on stage, and the jet lag's a factor, or they've like driven to like a hotel conference center and they slept in a hotel and they haven't, they're tired. Tiredness every single time is a factor, and you'll know more about like kind of the blood flow to the brain. And basically, so what happens is when your mind goes blank, that often you don't get as much blood flow to this, this frontal part of the brain. So you have less sort of capacity. So more things can like throw you off. And we've all had that, when we've been, we're at university, we've been studying. And all of a sudden, like everything becomes much more of a struggle. Like any kind of thinking becomes much more difficult. And that's a similar kind of thing that can happen when somebody goes blank on stage. And again, there is that whole deep nervous system like part of the of that speaking experience where we're kind of thinking, oh god, this is dangerous. So the system starts to go into I better get out of here. Like, I need to maybe find someone. I can't do this. I can't do this. And people can kind of almost go into like a freeze response, which is pretty awful and pretty traumatic.
Absolutely. I've seen that with mainly in the Professional Speaking Association. They have that, is it speaker factor, they call it, where new speakers have to do a little speech to us lot. And I really feel for them, because talking to your peers is there anything more difficult than that? I don't think there is.
I know. I've done it myself, and the kind of like, because basically normally when you give a keynote like to a company or something, they're all there to, like, you know, listen to your experience and like to have, you know, to learn something, to be entertained and informed. At this competition, there's 3 professional speakers in the front taking notes, judging you on every single point, like how you stand, how your script is, your delivery, your, you know, how bookable you are. So it's like a whole different ball game of like being judged. And for most people, of course, that sort of links back to like childhood and being punished for stuff that you did wrong, and for people laughing at you. So it kind of like can trigger, like, sorry to use that word again, but it can kind of trigger those sorts of memories as well. So it can be a bit of a nightmare, to be honest.
We have spoken previously about where the impact of story ends with trauma.
Yes.
But can we go back a bit and talk about where it begins? Because you said it already, you know, people tell you their story. How do you help people to tell you their story? Because that, we can come back to the where it ends bit in a minute.
Yeah.
If that's possible.
So the most important thing in therapy and any kind of like therapeutic relationship is like building that rapport and having them feel completely safe with you, and that whatever they say to you, you will listen to them, and you won't, like, you know, you won't disapprove of them, and you won't attack them. So sometimes people tell me things that they've never told anybody, and it's a real privilege. So that's the first thing, is really for me to establish that safety and rapport, so people can feel that they can tell you very, very private things, traumatic things that they've never told anybody. So that's kind of where it starts. But then there comes a point where where in trauma work especially, what we're ultimately hoping for is a thing called post-traumatic growth. So the person can say, yes, this thing happened to me, but it doesn't define me, and my life isn't defined by it. And that's like the kind of like the best thing that you could hope for from trauma work.
There's a few people out there that, again, we're both familiar with, who the post-traumatic growth thing, they see, I'm very interested in that, Olivia. I'm chuffed that you brought it up, because and it's got nothing to do with me. I don't know why I worry, but there are certainly a lot of speakers, and there is a lot of them, it's not one or two, who make their living about talking about their trauma.
Yes.
And is that a good thing?
So I've written about this as well. So it's a very, very fine line. So yes, we need to sort of destigmatize kind of mental health and trauma and all these kinds of things. But at the same time, when there's an audience of, like, say 200 people, and you're telling some very, very gory details of your own personal trauma in that room, there are going to be people there that have never told, if they've had something similar to them, they've never told anybody. It can actually drag up other people's trauma, and there is no sort of aftercare. So in that sense, it's all to do with the level of detail. And I've talked to my colleague, I don't know if you know Catherine Nibbs, she's a cyber trauma expert, and she's interviewed me about this as well. And she's been at conferences, like sort of like safeguarding conferences, where kind of speakers have put up slides where, with the intention of shocking, And there comes a point where there is a level of detail that is not appropriate to share because it's too triggering. And so there is this whole, like the whole everyone is like having a go at Prince Harry. Like, so there is this whole thing about, yes, your story is valid and all the rest of it, but like if you are going to share like details like that in public, some people are going to have a problem with it. And of course there comes this defiance of, well, I should be able to tell my story and people have tried to shut me up and blah blah, you can't attack me because I'm destigmatizing mental health. But at the same time, if you're actually traumatizing people in your audience, then there's a problem there. So there's a really fine balance there.
Yes.
And I'm sure you'll have your own thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever told this particular story because I don't want to traumatize people. So if you're listening or watching and you're sensitive to horrible accidents, then maybe tune out for 2 minutes. But I was involved in the Lockerbie disaster, and I was involved in it about 7 years after it happened because I was at university when it actually happened. And my professor and I used to go to every Friday lunchtime. We used to go to this briefing, and it was basically all the medical departments at Edinburgh University would come together every Friday and we would talk about our work. And we were working mainly in the arthritis space. So it was, bones and joints and, cartilage and microscopes and all that sort of stuff. But there was another professor who was a professor of anatomy called Professor Basutil. And he was a real character. And he was the person who'd been called in when Lockerbie happened. And for good reason, people don't really know what happened, when to the people who were in that plane. And of course, gravity means things fall to the ground. And I'll leave it to people's imagination, well, largely to their imagination. But we ended up talking to Professor Basutil, and he asked us to help with some of the study of impact, on the human body. I know, Olivia, I mean, I've seen some terrible, I've done a partial autopsy on a child. So, I mean, I've really done some terrible, I've done animal experiments as well. So horrible things. But seeing those photographs, that I'm getting the chills. I've not told that story before, I don't think. And it's given me the chills. But we spent about 3 months working on that. And it was mainly from photographic evidence, stroke, what they call cadaveric, dead body tissue. And I don't know if it traumatized me, but I certainly don't want to talk about it very much because I worry about people responding to it. But I think the point of it, I'd be interested in your perspective on that. But the second thing is that what I did notice in that room, the pathology staff and the anatomy staff, and I'm talking probably 90% of us, didn't bother about it. At the time, I did a little bit at the beginning, but then I got used to it, I guess. Does that make sense? I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but what's your...
Well, that's kind of how you can do your job. That's kind of how you could, if you would let it get to you, you wouldn't be able to do your job, basically. So with that like story, all those things you saw, I genuinely don't think from a therapeutic point of view, it would be helpful for you to talk that out and to describe that in detail with like as part of talk therapy. I don't honestly think that would help you. Like you managed to sort of compartmentalize it. You're able to like carry on. So from that point of view, it's you're not having nightmares about it or anything else. So from that point of view, talking about it wouldn't help you. Also, if you did, so I do a lot of like eye movement techniques with trauma, and the good thing about those eye movement techniques are that you don't have to tell the story. So a colleague of mine, Carl Jackson, he's a cool dude. He's a therapist, and he's also a bricklayer. And he had a client, and she'd fill in all the forms and stuff. First session comes. One thing she hadn't mentioned, that she was one of the children at the Dunblane massacre, and she'd had, 20 plus years of, the kind of post, she'd drinking too much, dangerous relationships, few suicide attempts. So he treated her with this eye movement technique where she didn't really talk about the Dunblane stuff, but they worked on it. We call it a content-free way of working. And it helped her so much that, she's now been able to go on to have a child finally, and she's learning how to do this therapy herself. So sometimes different sort of approaches can help people move past those things without having to go into the gory details. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. That does make sense. And I think the really interesting, I mean, I didn't expect to talk about this today. This just happened, I guess. But I think I'm actually feeling it's triggered me.
Yes, of course. Because you compartmentalized it.
Yeah. Because the other one that I did mention there, when I did that autopsy on an 8-year-old child, it was only the knee joint and the cervical spine. But that was horrific. And I remember if I go right back, it's weird how what it's done is it's made me really think about that whole 4-year process where when I did my first partial autopsy, I didn't even do it. I was just watching the professor doing it. And I remember I can smell it. I can remember the room really quite a lot of detail. And I haven't thought about that for, 10 years, Olivia.
Mm.
So it's still in your mind, isn't it?
Yes,
All this stuff. It doesn't go away.
It's still there, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So let's lighten the load a little bit. And I asked you if you could bring an artifact with you. Did you manage to do that?
I did. So I'll show it to you. So can everyone see it's a paperweight with a peacock feather inside it.
Lovely.
And it was given to me as part of a 10-year sort of anniversary for the person who taught me this therapy. And it's called systemic work. So systemic work really takes account of all the systems that you belong to. So, and they describe it as like the peacock, sort of like peacock's tail behind you. So every system that you've ever been belonged to. So for you, it would be like your school, your Scottish heritage, your family of origin, your universities you went to, all the different places you've worked, like the places you've lived. All those systems kind of make up who you are. And I think that's a really lovely way of looking at things. And also that somehow some of those systems were very positive and they kind of resource us and give us strength. And some of them weren't so positive, but they all make part of what made us, basically. I
think sorry, I'm just going to say what happened there because it's quite funny. There's actually a peacock. I don't know if you can hear it. There is a peacock in my neighbour's house.
Spooky.
And it's shouting right now. And then they're building in my garden and he's cutting stone. I don't know if you can hear it. I mean, you shouldn't be able to with this microphone, but I have it. That's why I had my microphone on mute.
That's so funny.
There really is.
He's like, yoo-hoo, I'm here.
I'll tell you what, I'll take a picture and I'll send it to you. Because it was quite funny because what happened was this peacock, it's a female peacock, what's it called? A peahen.
Yes.
Appeared in our back garden one day and it was a big white thing, huge thing, making this wah, wah noise that they make. And the next door neighbours decided they were going to keep it. So they tried to find its home, couldn't. So they've now got this huge peacock run in their garden. It's quite bizarre. Anyway, back to being serious again. I think this is, I mean, we're coming to the end, but I think what's interesting about this is that you've kind of proven the issue about artifacts. Now I come at it from helping people remember stories, but you've also demonstrated quite elegantly that an artifact or a memory or a story can trigger trauma, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I like about what you've said, like when you showed the artifact, I think people have hidden, I call them story hoards. I'm trying to extend this artifact, you'll be an archaeologist of your own life metaphor. And of course, they find coin hoards, Roman hoards, you know, and I thought, well, story hoards, why not? And have you any experience of that where maybe you've forgotten something and you saw something, and it doesn't need to be trauma, anything? Have you got an experience of that you could share?
Yes, absolutely. Anything can kind of take us back, can't it? I mean, I'm like 52 now. I've had like, you know, a lot of different parts to my life. Yes. And sometimes, you know, like even a phone call, like a phone call from someone I haven't spoken to for like 10 years the other day, like it just brings all that stuff back where you just think, wow, you know, I've had so many different experiences and different parts of my life and different, like, you know, social settings, different professional settings, different, you know, personal kind of relationships and stuff where you just think, wow, you know, there is a lot there. And yeah, it can kind of bring it back, you know, to the point where, you know, you see I like a photograph of someone who's no longer with us and you just think, oh my God, yeah, you know, I still think about that. You know, I had a friend who was bipolar who committed suicide, and like I see a photo of her, or sometimes I think of her and I think, wow, you know, well, she could have, you know, she was like, we used to do this, we used to do that. She was so funny. She was, you know, so you can kind of remember, and like some of these stories will come back to you. You know, it's pretty cool, really.
It is cool. And I think that the other thing that I said I'd come back to is about when the story can't take you any further. Because for those of you who might be interested in psychology, or possibly more likely pop psychology, I mean, Freud and Jung haven't been taken seriously in the psychological world for 30 years, but they continue to have a legacy. I mean, the Red Book still sells, people still talk about Freud, and whilst most of it was just made up nonsense, there are still people who think that talking therapy can help. Now, I don't know enough about it. I mean, I think it can help some people, I think. Then again, tarot cards help some people. So, you know, it doesn't need to be scientific for it to help someone. But what happens when it comes to an end, though? How do you know when talking's just not going to be enough? That next level?
I think kind of most of the time talking isn't enough. I've been lucky enough to be trained by two awesome kind of mentors. One's a psychologist, one's a medical doctor and psychotherapist. And they've really taught me like the importance of rapport and humor. And like, you know, even saying outrageous stuff with like a super great connection. They are just masters of that. They were both trained by Frank Farrelly in a thing called provocative therapy. So talking alone, like, oh, that thing happened to you. Oh, how do you feel about that? You know, like a friend of mine's wife died at the age of 42, and he finally went and had some kind of like grief counseling because he thought that's what you should have. And the therapist kept saying to him, well, how do you feel about that? And he was like, how the fuck do you think it makes me feel? You know, so there comes a point when that kind of therapy just it can be helpful to give us a bit of space to work out how we actually feel, but there are major limitations, especially if there's no rapport or you don't feel a connection or any kind of approval, or that your therapist kind of wants you, you know, wants you to stop coming. I mean, I'm so happy when a client says to me, oh, I aced it in a meeting or whatever. I'm like, I don't think I need to come back. And I'm like, yes, you know, I'm not interested in like having them hooked on me and having our sessions. You know, that's just kind of not how I work. It might be really, you know, that's not how I, you know, how I roll, basically. So talk therapy can have its place, but it also has its limitations. But it's all about the connection with the person. To some extent, even though I've got some amazing kind of like therapies, to some extent with the right kind of personal connection, it almost doesn't matter what modality you use. If you kind of have the level, like a level of safety and approval, and the person can really feel that they can be themselves and you want the best for them. I think that's priceless.
Yeah, here. I absolutely agree with you. I was making a film for a client of mine. I was writing the script really yesterday, and he had asked me about. I mean, I've had made some quite public comments about the gurus, particularly Simon Sinek, and you know, and he was laughing. Just you've just done, and I said it's not start with the why, it's start with the who. And he looked at me and he went, "You're right," because I mean, it's all about relationships. Everything's about relationships. And okay, you start with the inner work, but I don't think that needs to be the why. It could be the how. It could be anything else. Let's not go there. But look, that has been really, really interesting, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm sure they did. If there was somebody who wanted to get in, I mean, I've been putting your email address on the screen, but if someone wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, they can go to my website. I have you can drop me a message on there. If anybody wants to have a little chat with me, I offer like a 15-minute chat with them. So they can ask me questions. And I'm not one of these people, so I honestly don't know how to do a hard sell. A lot of these coaches, like if somebody comes to you, you have to like press their pain points and you have to like tell them that you're the one, you're the solution, blah, blah. I don't do any of that. I can't bear it. And so no worries like on that score. Like if anybody wants to just have a chat with me, then they can certainly do that. There's an option to book. Also, do connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my biggest platform. Got nearly 11,000 connections on there now.
Wow.
So connect with me. Drop me a message if you have any questions. I'd love to know what you thought.
And just those of you who are listening in, it's harleystreetcoach.com for Olivia's website. Final question. Over the last 4 or 5 months, you have been absolutely incredible with your push for media exposure. Tell us about that.
So I think part of it is that I'm probably a bit of a frustrated journalist, and so I sort of love bringing my kind of insight and analysis to like things that are happening right now. So I've just done a piece on like why the summer was such a letdown for Metro. I did one about postgraduate depression, like the insights. I've done one on the trauma of Trump, for example. So I've done various different sort of expert comments in sort of different areas. I've done one about I've done various ones about trauma, kind of the medical trauma I was talking about earlier on. So yes, I kind of really enjoy it. I've just done I'm just doing one about that's coming out soon about like the therapeutic value of doing puzzles. I'm really excited about that. So yes, I kind of I like to sort of bring my insight to kind of current affair stories and how the kind of mainly how the kind of the physiological and the psychological kind of interact when it comes to like trauma reactions, when it comes to kind of mental health and trauma and physical health.
Right, very good. Olivia, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks for being on the show. It's been enlightening and lovely to speak to you as always. Thanks for coming on ARTEFACTlive. So I hope everyone enjoyed that. I did. It was very interesting, and I think the way Olivia communicates her work is very helpful to people who are traumatized but don't know what to do about it. Because I mean, personally, I find Olivia very easy to talk to, and I think she hasn't ever offered me therapy. I think she maybe did once, but I've never taken it up. But nevertheless, it's something that I would suggest that you should do. So thanks again, Olivia. That was fantastic. Now, because Olivia was on this week, and I knew she was going to be talking about trauma, I wanted to take it to the next level next week by having a dialogue with someone who has encountered severe trauma and has come through that and is now, you know, moving on with her life. So next week we've got Chris Freer on. Now, Chris contacted me about 3 or 4 weeks ago with his story, and he was diagnosed. He was a very, very successful publican. He owned multiple pubs and clubs, and he had started to feel unwell, and it turned out he had multiple sclerosis. I'll leave the rest of the story to Chris next week, but I would strongly recommend you tune in if you've been interested. If you've enjoyed this week with Olivia, I think next week we'll really add another layer into that area. Now, I have no, you know, this show is not going to be developing into a trauma show, far from it, but I think those two together will sit really rather lovely. And then the following week, I've got a professor from the States coming on who's going to talk about decision making. So I'm trying to connect some of these things in hopefully an interesting way. So thanks again for tuning in. This was Artefact Live. My name is Scott MacArthur, and we try really hard to encourage you to tell your own stories. And again, thank you to Olivia for that, because the way she described the interaction with new clients of hers, again, was useful. She gives them that space to talk to her about their particular trauma. And I think those stories, despite the conversation that Olivia and I had about, you know, is it good to share your trauma? Let's move away from trauma for a minute. It could work for you in trauma, but let's move away from trauma. I honestly think that stories can change the world. And if we all act as like archaeologists of our own life, we can find stories that genuinely can change the world. Thank you very much for tuning in. See you next week. My name is Scott MacArthur. Good afternoon.